Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in today. We are going to be talking about early symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And it'll be really interesting to get your feedback on this episode if you are someone who is diagnosed with MS currently, what your earliest symptom was. So often, when I'm working with patients who have multiple sclerosis, we always talk about the diagnosis. And my favorite question to ask isn't necessarily, how long have you had MS? I like to ask, when were you diagnosed and when were your first symptoms? Because more often than not, your first symptoms, they're not the same date or even the same year as when you were diagnosed. And I will say at this point, I've been a physical therapist for 11 years and a multiple sclerosis certified specialist for 9 years. And I would say the first 7 years of being an MS specialist, when I asked my patients, when was your first symptom and when were you diagnosed, there would be a gap on average of like 10 to 15 years, with a decent amount of my patients saying a 20-year gap of their first symptom versus when they were diagnosed. But the average, I would say, was like 10 to 15 years apart. But now, within the last 2 years, people more likely than not are saying anywhere from 1 to 5 years. So diagnosis is happening earlier, which is amazing because the earlier you are diagnosed, the earlier you can start whatever type of management protocol suits you and what you and your doctors agree with. But it's really exciting because the first step is noticing symptoms. Everything starts from the noticing the symptoms. And then you're able to reach out to the appropriate healthcare provider, get the appropriate testing done, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really great that diagnosis is happening earlier. So getting diagnosed earlier is a huge step in the right direction. I like to think that's because technology is getting better. MRIs are getting better, and we're able to see bigger differences and more lesions that potentially you couldn't see before. I don't necessarily think more people are getting MS. I think it's just more accurately being diagnosed. With that said, we're going to talk in a bit about misdiagnosis, but I want to first discuss early symptoms of MS. And let me actually first start by saying that not everyone who experiences these symptoms that we're about to go into have multiple sclerosis or even will have MS. There's quite a long list that we're about to go through of common early symptoms of MS. But as you see and hear, several of these conditions can mean many other things. So we'll touch on that at the end. But first, let's dive into what those symptoms are. The number one early symptom of MS, and the one that I find most intriguing, is vision problems, specifically blurred vision, double vision, or eye pain. And the reason I find this so fascinating is because for years and years and years, we've been told the first symptom of MS is often vision symptoms. And while that might be true in lots of cases, I've discussed this with lots of neurologists and neuro-ophthalmologists. And it's so interesting because the conversation usually turns into the thought that maybe it's not the most common early symptom, but rather vision problems affect our daily living and our quality of life. And so we seek attention and guidance and help when our vision is affected earlier than if it's something else that was affected. Like if you had numbness in your leg, you might not go to the doctor right away. Or if you had weakness randomly, you might not go to the doctor right away. But if it's a vision change, most of us would go to the doctor right away, or at least earlier than some of the other symptoms we're about to dive into. So then that poses the question of, is it really the most common or just the one that affects us the most? So we seek guidance earlier, leading to an earlier diagnosis of MS. Regardless, vision changes are one of the most common early symptoms of MS, and specifically optic neuritis. But vision symptoms is one of the first one. Next up, this probably won't surprise you, it's fatigue. Fatigue is one of the most common symptoms of MS, but not only that, it's one of the most common ones that is an early symptom of MS. It's one of those ones where often people don't necessarily realize they were experiencing until after the fact. like something else happened and now they're diagnosed with MS. And now that they have that diagnosis, they start to think back and they realize, oh, yeah, I've had extreme fatigue for like 5 years. Or I remember this time 10 years ago where for no reason at all, I was so fatigued, and that's primary fatigue. And now it's all clicking. Like maybe that was actually when I had my first symptom. So, fatigue, specifically the type where it's primary fatigue, meaning unexplained tiredness, and it interferes with your daily activities. So, this is not the type of fatigue that everyone, even people without MS, experience. It's the type that is directly caused from multiple sclerosis, which means there's no reason other than having MS. You didn't stay up late at night. You didn't overexercise. You got great night's sleep. There's no reason that you can think of that you would be fatigued, yet here you are feeling really fatigued. The next one is numbness or tingling. And oftentimes this is in your limbs or your trunk. And oftentimes it's on one side of your body. Not always, but typically numbness or tingling and the next symptom, which is weakness. If you have one of those initially, it's just one side of your body. It might be just your right side. And typically it's just the upper or lower body when it's an early symptom. So you might have numbness or tingling on your right leg only or in your right arm, but not necessarily both the right arm and leg or both sides, like the right leg and the left leg. So typically it's one limb and it's on one side of your body when it is that numbness, tingling, any type of sensory change. And if we dive even deeper into that, sensory changes are anything that has an abnormal sensation. It could mean numbness, tingling, burning, pins and needles. Other common ones that I hear, it feels like bugs are crawling on your skin or under your skin. It could be that you have less sensation or hyper sensation or more sensation. So any type of sensation change that doesn't feel normal to you would fall under this category. And then moving on to weakness, same idea with one limb, one side of the body, typically, at least as an early symptom. And the weakness might be present in the sense of it's hard for you to do something, like standing up from the floor was challenging, or bending your knee is challenging, or lifting your leg to get into your car is challenging. Or you might notice it in a way where it affects your walking, like your knee is buckling and giving way, or your knee hyperextends. Those are things that happen due to weakness in your leg. So that's another way that it could present. On the theme of walking, another early symptom of MS is balance and coordination issues. And more often than not, you're going to notice these when you're walking because you're feeling off balance. So you might trip or you might feel clumsy. But another component of balance and coordination can be dizziness. And this sometimes can lead to vision changes. So it kind of is related to the first one that we discussed, those vision symptoms, but dizziness can cause us to feel unbalanced and it can cause us to lose track of where we are, especially if we're in a crowd. So balance and coordination, dizziness, clumsiness, etc., can often be an early symptom of MS. Cognitive changes are another common early symptom. I recently saw a report that said 35% of people diagnosed with MS will have some level of cognitive changes at the point of their diagnosis. So that's quite a lot. 35% have that as a symptom early on when they are diagnosed. Bladder dysfunction is another one. And when I say dysfunction, what I mean is any form of incontinence. So it might be bladder urgency, where you feel like you need to go pee all the time, where you feel a sudden onset of needing to go to the bathroom right away. It's very urgent. Or bladder or urinary frequency, meaning you just have to go pee all the time. Or incontinence, maybe it is a little bit of leaking. There's lots of different types of urinary incontinence, but the two most common associated with early onset and symptoms of MS is frequency and urgency. The last common early symptom of MS is pain, but specifically neuropathic pain. And neuropathic pain occurs when a condition like multiple sclerosis affects the nerves that carry sensations to the brain. So, if you were to shake someone's hand, if you did not have MS or any other condition that affects pain and our neural pathways, if you were to shake someone's hand, you would just feel the sensation of someone else's hand. And what happens is the receptors on your hand feel that person's hand, and a message gets sent up to your brain via nerves that tells your brain this is a hand and this hand is soft or whatever it feels like to you. But neuropathic pain is when the condition that you have, in this case MS, it affects those nerves that tell your brain what you're feeling. So you might go to shake someone's hand, and instead of it feeling like a hand and soft, it might feel like pain. Or maybe it feels numb or sharp. It might feel different. It's not necessarily a real sensation. It feels real, but it's due to missignaling in the neural pathways. So that's what neuropathic pain is. It can also be called nerve pain or neuralgia. Now, that's a lot of symptoms. There's a lot of early symptoms of MS, and there's a lot of symptoms overall of multiple sclerosis. But one thing that is important to keep in mind for early symptoms of MS are the characteristics that could indicate if it's MS versus something else. And there's three things that you can think of that would help you determine if it's MS or something else. Number one, they often come and go. So it's not always there. And this is more of a relapsing nature. The second is that it can vary in intensity. So let's say weakness is one of your first symptoms. You might think back to when you were first diagnosed and realize, yeah, there were some days where I was so weak, I couldn't get out of bed. And then there were other days where I was weak, but I could still walk. Maybe there were other days where you were weaker, but you were walking and tripping all the time. So it's various levels of intensity. Same with pain or vision. It wasn't always the same level of severity. And then thirdly, they may worsen with heat or stress. A very common symptom of MS is heat intolerance, which is also called Otoff's phenomenon. And this is when any symptom worsens when your core temperature rises by at least half of a degree. And so it's a great indicator of if MS is a possibility or not, because if you happen to notice that your vision changes are worse when it's hot outside or right after you took a hot shower, or if you're really stressed, or if you just exercise, that condition, which follows Otoff's phenomenon, is associated with multiple sclerosis. So it might put you on the diagnosis track of being diagnosed with MS. Another important thing to know about symptoms, early symptoms of MS, are the patterns. So symptoms typically last more than 24 hours, and symptoms affect different parts of the body over time. So as we were initially saying, it might affect your right leg. Over time, it might also be your right arm or maybe your left leg. But generally speaking, one side of the body typically remains weaker than the other side. So if you start to notice any patterns, that's more so gradual and over time versus early, but still something to be on the lookout for. Now, as I mentioned initially, I feel like this is actually a really touchy subject because so many of the early symptoms of MS are often early symptoms of other things that are not MS. And it could be other neurological or autoimmune conditions, or it could just be something like a pinched nerve in your back or a tight muscle that's causing muscle tightness that's also causing sensory changes like the tingling, like sciatica. If you are not diagnosed with MS, please take these symptoms with a grain of salt and combine it with the other components that we talked about, like the characteristics of the symptoms and the severity and the changes, how long they are lasting, things like that. Just because you have one of these symptoms does not mean that you have MS or another condition. And I'm actually going to record another episode in a bit on misdiagnosis and the other common diagnoses that are associated with MS, there's actually a very high rate of misdiagnosis in multiple sclerosis. So I think that's something we need to be aware of and discuss. But when it comes to early symptoms of MS, the ones that we mentioned today are going to be the most common ones. So if you are feeling one or any of those, and if you've had in the back of your mind that you might have MS, so often when someone's diagnosed with MS and I'm talking to them, they say, oh, my aunt has MS. I was wondering if this is what that could be. Or I have a friend with MS and hers started somewhat similar. I was wondering, it can never hurt to get things checked out. Make sure you are being aware of what your symptoms are, the different patterns that they're following, and reach out to your general practitioner, your general healthcare provider, and see what they think. And if it's worth getting even more testing to see if there is a possible diagnosis, or maybe go to a physical therapist and rule out any type of orthopedic condition that could be causing one or several of these symptoms. If any of these symptoms have a sudden onset and or are severe, seek medical attention right away. The sooner you can get attention and guidance and help for any of these, the better off you'll be in the long run. I hope you found this episode helpful, and I'm really curious to know what your first symptom was, or maybe it was a couple of symptoms. So reach out to me on social media or wherever you like to find me and let me know, because this is something that is so diverse and so variable for each person with MS.